Hello and welcome to our first live session. So this is Wastewater Wisdom Live. This will be a series of live product sessions where we will be hosting every Tuesday going forward. So obviously today we're talking all things wastewater. So we'll have one about stormwater next week. Week after that will be rainwater, and so on and so forth. And we'll have in these sessions one of our technical product specialists. We'll get them in the hot seat and get them to answer all your questions regarding the subject. So obviously with today we've got David, who is our resident specialist on all things wastewater treatment. He knows more about wastewater treatment than most humans ever should. But anyway, take away, David. How are you doing today?
I'm extremely well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all well. Thank you for joining us this morning. Hopefully, dive down into some interesting topics for you today. Share some stories with you. Obviously, the Christmas through, and hopefully, you'll gain some from joining us this morning.
So this is kind of like the first time we've done a sit-down live session.
It certainly is.
This is kind of new for us in this setup, but we've done CPDs now. We've done plenty of those, and we've got 2 more lined up in the next coming days. So we're literally going live, talking all things wastewater for the next 2 or 3 days. So we're really in for a treat. Saying pretty much going all things wastewater, it does take its toll on the human body after a while. But anyway, today we'll be talking about our main topic for obviously today's discussion is what you will need to consider when installing a sewage treatment plant. So David, take it away. If it was me, I was building my house out in the sticks, what would I need to consider when needing to install a sewage treatment plant for my property?
Okay, lots to consider. It's not as straightforward as one may think. Initially, you would want to have a look at tank location. Along with the tank location, you need to consider where your discharge point will be, where you potentially have your electrics to support the system. Moving on to the ground solution. With the discharge, will you go to ground or will you potentially go to a flowing water course? If you're doing the wastewater treatment system, you have the option to go to a water course. Traditionally speaking, with a septic tank, you would normally go into ground via a drainage field. So that's the initial thing you'd want to look at. Moving on from that, you'd need to really start thinking about the type of system. Now, this changes with different manufacturers. Certainly here at Graph, we talk about sequence batch reactors, so a very controlled treatment process with a control panel and compressor to control the operation inside the treatment plant. Other manufacturers use big fed systems, which have got slightly different technology inside the tank to basically bring the air into the tank to improve the biological environment and breaking down of the panel and inside the capital quality, which is the water discharge from the system. You generally need to also think about how are you going to go about installing it. So with wastewater, you generally need to have a ground worker to install the pipe runs, the underground tanks, and the drainage solution if you are going to go to ground. On top of that, you're going to need an electrician to basically bring in power to the kiosk or control cabinets to control the working system. Now, as systems get bigger, you generally have basically slightly more larger power requirements. So certainly on domestic level, you're talking probably 2 watt supply, but with the bigger commercial developments, you're looking at potentially 3-phase power. So you need a lot more expertise in terms of those bigger projects. That's certainly you might want to bear in mind if you're looking at a bigger system. Alongside that, probably one final thing is just really to understand supplies hit and the stuff that needs to be incorporated within that. Certainly with ours, it's tank and a control panel element, and basically running air hose lines through the tank. So the regular systems on the market where you've got electrics inside the tank and working components like electric pumps and stuff. So having an understanding of what the system will provide you will help you really set up the system correctly during the installation process.
Earlier in that, you mentioned with obviously treatment plants, you can either go to discharging to ground through a drainage field takeaway, or it can be discharged into a flowing water course. What variables would dictate what option is available? If I was installing, what kind of variables would I get?
Good question. Generally speaking, the environment agencies and water authorities would prefer the discharge to the ground. With discharge to the ground, we generally have a a percolation test result and further filtration of the water. And with that, of course, we have a much better release into the environment, so it has less impact. The other option would be to go to a water course. Now, I have to flown water course through 365 days of the year. And with that, of course, the water will evacuate from the site. Now, with the shot in the ground, you generally have to try a percolation test to find out whether the soil in the ground is suitable for percolation liquid. With percolation, generally you do a test over a 6 hour period, find out how long it takes for the water to discharge into the ground, and then providing on how fast that is, it needs to be within a certain range. We generally refer to it as a VP rate, and it's normally falls between 15 and 100. And if you're within that range, which basically the ground is deemed suitable for percolation. So, generally speaking, environment agencies and bodies would prefer you to discharge into ground where possible. Depending on other things in and around it, you might need to consider water courses, for example, or basically possible water sources. So if you're within 50 meters of a possible water source, you can't discharge back into that area. So there's really lots to consider. Most of this is laid out in the building regulation section H for discharging of foul water wastewater treatment systems. So another document for customers to refer to for further guidance.
Perfect. So I think that's everything covered in what we have to discuss, or what I would need to consider when installing a treatment plant for my project. So we've got the main discussion point done. I hope that's been very helpful. Next, we're going to talk about the recent project you and your twin brother Michael had to look after.
Yep.
So give us the grounds of this project. Bring us back to the start. Give us the full story of this project.
So the initial project request was for a 28 pop system, which was one of our Claro 2 tank systems. So that was supplied towards the tail end of last year. On the supply, we were asked to commission the system. We were just asked to go back at the beginning of last week to commission the system. Now, when commissioning a system, you generally ask the customer to fill out a checklist to make sure everything's kind of in place. So when you go, you are just checking the workings of the system, and then you're signing off completion. Now, when our engineer Michael arrived on site, he found that the tank was in no fit state for commissioning. It was barely in the ground, in fact. Now, it's kind of still good that he went, because we were able to identify a few problems and basically advise the ground workers. So it's kind of more like a site survey / investigation more than a commissioning. So we will return to the site once they're a bit further along to commission it. But we were able to advise the customer on a few things, and hopefully they can get the system into the ground in the next couple of weeks, and we can return and get the system signed off.
Perfect. So that wasn't the main story of it. So when your brother went to site, what was the first thing that you identified went wrong with the system?
Okay, now, as I said, it was a 2-tank Claro system. Now, when we send out our systems, we generally send out a document which basically outlines the system supply and how it all comes together. And inside that, the tanks, of course, have various labels and stuff on them to instruct of whether tank 1, tank 2, what the inlet and the outlet is. Unfortunately, the ground workers had not seen the orientation of the tanks correctly, and they actually installed the primary tank the wrong way around. In so doing, that's the charging airlift, which we use to lift water between tanks, basically was facing the inlet. So what that was doing is, if they were to introduce water into that, you'll basically choke the incoming pipe work, and it would back up. So we were able to on site basically advise the customer that how to disconnect that, rotate it through 180 degrees, and have it lifting waste the correct way when we get the system up and operational.
So when you say they didn't see the orientation of the tanks, what do you specifically mean by that?
Well, it's generally a good thing to look at installation instructions. Maybe in this case, they didn't refer to it. They thought they knew better. But once again, it's kind of like an important rule of thumb. If you don't know, if you're unsure, just ask. We are here to help, of course. And it was quite a strange one. I'm really pleased that we did go to the site. And and we were able to identify this early because it could have been quite problematic a bit further on down the line if we had left it a bit longer. So it was a worthwhile visit.
But when you say identifying or looking at the install instructions to identify the issue, you're being very kind, because what's the first thing that both you and I know with our tanks when they go out? What is signaled on our tanks? What is, should I say, labeled?
The outlet is generally labeled on the outside,
and so is the inlet.
And so is the inlet. Yes.
In bright stickers.
In bright red stickers, yeah. So
maybe we need to change the color. Maybe the red wasn't bright enough. Maybe that was it.
Well, it's on a grey tank, so I'm pretty sure it's pretty visible. But in this case, of course, unfortunately, someone wasn't on the digger, wasn't looking correctly, and maybe the orientation of the tank was hiding that from him when it was dropped down to the ground. But who knows? It's in the past now. I'm just trying to be polite about it.
We'll give them the benefit of the doubt.
We'll give them the benefit of the doubt, yeah.
But what happened is the problem come in, and then you sent your brother to the site to then go and fix.
Yes, and as is with all things, we are nicely sat in our cozy office and sending out our poor engineers to site to find these problems. And I thought what was supposed to be a nice commissioning visit turned out to be a bit more of a engaging and hands-on experience. But yeah, pleased that we went and were able to help the customer out where we did.
Cool. At least he didn't have to get into the tank.
This time around, he did not have to get down into the tank. Yes.
No. So there are silver linings to these stories with all wastewater treatment, because there's going to be someday we're going to have to get into a tank, and once the waste is out, and it's not the nicest things to do. But anyway, David, thank you for talking us through that recent project. So now we're coming to the Q&A section of today's talk, and we have a few questions lined up already. So if you're watching, we will just say, make sure you put your questions in the comment section either of the YouTube stream, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and we can see them popping up, and we can answer all your questions as they come in. So the first one that's come in is, could you tell people the main differences between our one-to-clean system and our advanced wastewater treatment systems?
Okay, so when Callum refers to advanced wastewater treatment systems, this is generally speaking the more commercial and higher-end technology we use for treating certain parameters inside the treatment plants. So our standard one-to-clean system is a relatively standardized system. We're generally there just to break down the components laid out within the British Water Flows and Loads, which is the BOD, the suspended solids, and ammonia. And with the one-to-clean system, we've got a single aeration basin or reactor, and to do that, so we can achieve very, very good qualities of effluent on domestic loadings. We then step up to the advanced systems, or the Claro systems, and basically we change the control technology to the system, so we can add in dosing pumps, and chlorine reaction chambers, UV treatment. So we're able to offer a much higher quality of targeted treatment to certain parameters which might be required on certain sites. There are various topics and projects going around which have basically requirements to tackle nitrogen and both phosphorus, and with the advanced system technology which we have with the Claro and advanced systems, we're able to really focus on those and get very good quality of effluent in terms of reduction of the parameters discharged from the treatment plant. So that's probably the main two. One-to-clean is basically a standard domestic system, and from that we can build on to that advanced technology via the control panel to treat the effluent in a bit more details, to really get what the customer needs out of the system. So hopefully that's relatively clear, the two main differences.
Perfect. We've got another question come in. How could a homeowner tell when their septic tank is full and when it needs to be emptied?
Okay, septic tank is slightly tricky. Most septic tanks will have with them a designed storage level, which they should be able to obtain from the manufacturer. And with that, you need to take into consideration the volume of the tank versus how many people are feeding it. And then from that, you can pretty much gauge how quickly that tank is going to become full. Because if you've got, say, for example, 3 people living in a property and you've got a tank designed for 6 persons, for example, then you'd probably think that the tank storage is going to last you twice as long as what the manufacturer's guidelines are. That will, of course, vary depending on how frequently or how much time is spent in the property from those 3 people. But generally speaking, you would see anything from 6 months to a year for a septic tank. If you wanted to get a bit more dive down deep into it, you can get sludge level pipettes, which basically is like a dipstick to drop down into the tank, and with that you can judge how much sludge volume you've got within the tank. And of course, the manufacturer will give you the maximum volume before you want to get that discharge. But generally, that sort of thing would be carried out by a service engineer. So yeah, if you wanted to have your system serviced, certainly in the form of a treatment plant, this would need to be considered. But in terms of a septic tank, which kind of looks after itself a bit more, you may not want to. But hopefully that'll give them a bit of an idea of in terms of sludge levels in the tank, and of course the frequency of has to be disludged.
Perfect. We've got another question coming in. What is the minimum distance someone can install a sewage treatment plant from a property?
If you're following the guidelines, rules laid out in building regulations, it's generally 7 meters away from property. Now, this is generally good practice because a treatment plant is a working system. Most treatment plants, if they're working well, should be odorless. Generally, a good indication the treatment plant is working poorly is the fact that it will smell. Of course, if you've got a treatment plant right next to your property, you don't want it to be smelling. So having the tank 7 meters away will help, of course, with that if you were to have problems with treatment process. But yeah, bad smells, treatment plant's not working correctly, it needs to be addressed. So it's not something that you can just brush under a rug and just leave. It should be sorted out as quickly as possible. Of course, in some circumstances, most people don't have 7 meters in their back garden to install a wastewater treatment plant. And sometimes they don't have an area to discharge to ground via a drainage field, which has to be 15 meters away. So within that, basically, you have to really consider with the building authority who's going to sign off the project what the best possible solution is based on the area space you have available. And with that, hopefully, you can come to an agreement, which will then be signed off at the end of the project. So it's just something to bear in mind. If you can follow the regulations, please do so. But if you can't, you need to speak with the building authority who's going to sign off the project. And then, yeah, with that in line, you can then come to a compromise, which will take into consideration the best possible solution.
Perfect. More coming in. If someone needs a sewage treatment plant for 2 properties next door to each other, what is the best, or what is best for them? Is it to install one system to feed the multiple properties, or is it best to have kind of one system for each property?
It's an interesting question. If the homeowner is going to adopt the system, actually it's going to belong to them, then I would normally encourage that they have 2 separate working systems. This is just generally for political reasons between the 2 homeowners. If, of course, the treatment plant was to have problems, of course, it's basically the other one will just end up blaming the other one. And generally, you want to avoid that. You want to have good relationships with your neighbours. So individually installing separate treatment plants, they've each got to look after their own. That would probably be the most appreciated situation. It might be that it's potentially a brother and then maybe a sister living quite close to each other. But that might be okay for whilst they're living there. But of course, if they're to move out, sell the property on, of course, you'd then have that conflict. So again, in that situation, it's probably best to install separate treatment plants. If a local council, of course, is going to take on the maintenance and servicing of the system, then by all means install a bigger treatment plant to support potentially a group of homes. The treatment plant will therefore be looked after. It will then be, basically be serviced by them, be emptied by them, and you're not going to have that problem with potentially neighbours falling out over who's paying for what if needs to be serviced, maintained, desludged. So that would be my general advice. With the local authorities, I know that they would encourage people to install bigger systems where possible. So that's just something to take on board.
Perfect. Thank you, David. I think that's all the questions that have come in. Thank you for tuning in to our first ever Wastewater Wisdom Live. The next one will be Stormwater School next Tuesday at 10 a.m. So you better make sure you don't miss that. And we'll have a stormwater expert in the hot seat to answer all your questions regarding to stormwater management. So yeah, thank you again for tuning in and watching. Take care and have a great week.
Thank you.